How do you define poetry?
I define poetry as language being used in the most artistic way possible. A way to look at the world and think, how would this sound attractive in a sentence? And what do I see that is poetry, and how can I put that on a piece of paper?
How do you define kinetic poetry?
I define kinetic poetry as a new genre of poetry that invites more than one of the five senses to be involved. A good kinetic poem would be one that begs someone who's reading it to want to move, to want to sing, to want to be involved with a different discipline.
What does kinetic poetry teach you about poetry that the page alone cannot? And vice versa, what are you learning about movement or dance through this interdisciplinary engagement?
I think what I'm learning about poetry the most in creating kinetic poetry is how ambiguous it is, and we're taught in elementary school that you can't interpret a poem incorrectly, and I'm really realizing when I'm thinking about more than one discipline here that there are so many different ways to interpret movement. There's so many different ways to interpret space on a page. Is this a negative space or is this a white space? Does the white space hold more depth, hold more emotional value than considering it a negative space? And I think what I'm learning about in movement is that it's also very ambiguous, and I've done lots of research on crossmodal congruency and learning about how I can scientifically kind of back this up, that what I'm imagining visually can make sense that's conveyed like on a page. Thinking about what comes to mind is like scents, smells, and colors. How does my brain understand that correlation, and how can I make the same correlation to movement and what's written on a page? And how can I portray that through my voice when also speaking and saying the poem out loud while it's being danced to?
Syntax is often understood as the rhythm of thought in a poem expressed via the order of words. About syntax, Bryant Voight writes, "This structure, this architecture, is the essential drama of the poem's composition." How do you interpret syntax in kinetic poetry?
To me, syntax serves as the math behind a poem. Thinking about where specific elements are placed, where is this space placed, and does this comma serve as a replacement of negative space in a way? How much distance can I apply to a page and it still makes sense in tandem with punctuation? I think what Voight says here is really insightful, that syntax adds the drama, because if you were to add an extra space between a word, if you were to completely have an end stop to a line, that completely changes how it would be spoken out loud, and that changes how every reader may read it. And so syntax is what propels kinetic poetry.
Do you feel like you're discovering new aspects of yourself as an artist in the kinetic poetry process?
I definitely think I am, both as a poet and as a dancer. Poetry has always been kind of what I've turned to since I was younger. I don't love to read novels from start to finish. It's a lot of reading to do, and so I'm finding that I can create longer poems in thinking about how they might move visually. I think when I'm writing a poem and I'm thinking about it under a kinetic poetry lens, that I have more to say in movement, so therefore maybe I have more to say on a page. And consequently with that, thinking about how I've changed as a dancer as well, thinking about, I've been a dancer since I was 2, and with recent health complications, I can't dance under the same Balanchine technique that I've been trained in my entire life. And so learning how I can move more organically and have that still be considered art is really interesting. And thinking about how that may be a means of advocacy to those who may not be experienced dancers or poets, or people who may not consider themselves experts in any of this. How can they still relate to that? And I think that's the goal with kinetic poetry, is to make it accessible to the masses.
How do you define poetry?
I think I define poetry as the language of emotion, and that being said, using poetry as a way to express complex emotions through skillful craft elements. I'm thinking specifically Cizena, enjambment. How can a poem be on a page and visually express one's thoughts that prose may not be able to in a specific type of block form?
When the rain pours, I like to make tea. I draw a bath, and only my nose floats above the water. I'm upset, so I steep in it. When the water weakens me, it flows down leaky pipes. I shiver by the drain as drizzle slides down the window pane. When my cup is empty, my tea leaves rest at the bottom, wet clumps of what once was, warning me of what's to come.